Excerpts from Part 2, Chapter 8 of Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. Only the laundry knew how scared I was. Louis was shaken. He'd been in Hawaii for only 2 months, yet already several dozen men from his bomb group, including more than a quarter of the men in his barracks, had been killed. The first loss had come on the flight from San Francisco, when a B-24 had simply vanished. This fate was sadly common. Between 1943 and 1945, 400 AAF crews were lost en route to their theaters. Next, a plane had caught fire and crashed at Kahuku, killing 4 men. Another plane had hit a mountain. A bomber had been forced down after losing all 4 engines, killing 2. In one bomber, a green engineer transferring fuel across the wings had caused gasoline to pool on the floor of the bomb bay. When the bomb bay doors had scraped open, igniting a spark, the plane had exploded. 3 men had survived, including a passenger whose hand had happened to be resting on a parachute when the blast flung him from the plane. After the Wake raid, a plane sent to photograph the damage had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. The crew had sent out a last message, "Can't make it," and was never heard from again. Then had come Coxwell's crash. These losses, only one due to enemy action, were hardly anomalous. In World War II, 35,933 AAF planes were lost in combat and accidents. The surprise of the attrition rate is that only a fraction of the ill-fated planes were lost in combat. In 1943, in the Pacific Ocean area's theater in which Phil's crew served, for every plane lost in combat, some 6 planes were lost in accidents. Over time, combat took a greater toll, but combat losses never overtook non-combat losses. As planes went, so went men. In the Air Corps, 35,946 personnel died in non-battle situations, the vast majority of them in accidental crashes. Even in combat, airmen appear to have been more likely to die from accidents than combat itself. A report issued by the AAF Surgeon General suggests that in the 15th Air Force, between November 1st, 1943 and May 25th, 1945, 70% of men listed as killed in action died in operational aircraft accidents, not as a result of enemy action. In many cases, the problem was the planes, in part because they were new technology, and in part because they were used so heavily. Planes were prone to breakdowns. In January 1943 alone, Louis recorded in his diary 10 serious mechanical problems in Superman and other planes in which he flew, including 2 in-flight engine failures, a gas leak, oil pressure problems, and landing gear that locked, fortunately in the down position. Once, Superman's brakes failed on landing. By the time Phil got the plane stopped, the bomber was 3 feet short of the runway's end. Just beyond it lay the ocean. The risks of flying were compounded exponentially in combat. From the sky came Japanese fighters, chief among them the swift, agile Zero, which dominated the sky in the first half of the war. Zero pilots pummeled bombers with machine gun fire and massively destructive 20mm cannon shells, which rammed gaping holes in their targets. When these failed, Some Zero pilots rammed their planes into bombers, kamikaze style. One B-24 returned to base with half of a Zero hanging from his wing. From the ground came anti-aircraft fire, including flak, which burst into razor-sharp metal shards that sliced planes open. To survive AA fire and enemy aircraft, bomber pilots needed to change their altitude and direction constantly. But on approach, the Norden bomb sight, not the pilot, flew the plane, so evasive action was impossible. B-24s were in the control of the bomb site for 3 to 5 minutes on approach. Japanese rangefinders needed less than 60 seconds to pinpoint bomber altitude. The math favored the Japanese. In combat, bombers even posed risks to one another. To fend off fighter attack and hit narrow target islands, planes had to bunch very close together. In the chaos, planes collided, fired on each other, and worse. In one incident, 3 B-24s on a mission to mine a harbor flew in tight formation through a narrow canyon at 50 feet under intense ground fire. As they dropped over the harbor, the right wingtip of a plane piloted by Lieutenant Robert Strong struck the greenhouse window on the plane to his right, piloted by a Lieutenant Robinson. The collision rotated Strong's bomber onto its left side and under Robinson's plane, just as Robinson's bombardier dropped a 1,000-pound mine. The mine crashed into Strong's plane, and though it didn't detonate, it tore an 18-square-foot hole in the fuselage and lodged itself just behind the waist gunners. Strong's B-24 was nearly cut in two, and the mine's parachute deployed, dragging the plane down. Crewmen cut the parachute free and shoved at the mine, but it wouldn't budge, so they dismantled their guns and used the barrels to crowbar the mine out. As Strong tried to get the nearly bisected plane home, the tail flapped in the wind, and a huge crack crept up the fuselage. Impossibly, Strong flew his Liberator 800 miles and landed. When Jesse Stay, a pilot in Louis' squadron, went to see the bomber, he was nearly able to pull its tail off with one hand. The risks of combat created grim statistics. In World War II, 52,173 AAF men were killed in combat. According to Stay, who would become a squadron commander, airmen trying to fulfill the 40 combat missions that made up a Pacific bomber crewman's tour of duty had a 50% chance of being killed. Along with safe return, injury, and death, airmen faced another possible fate. During the war, thousands of airmen vanished, some during combat missions, some on routine flights. Many had been swallowed by the ocean. Some were alive, but lost on the sea or islands, and some had been captured. Unable to find them, the military declared them missing. If they weren't found within 13 months, they were declared dead.